Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Anandasangaree, the Member of Parliament for Scarborough Rouge Park, and I'm joined here virtually today by Ahrabi Rajkumar, who is with the People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, or PEARL, Dr. Madura Rasaratnam, who's the Associate Professor in Comparative Politics at City University in London, and Sri Thanabalasingam, an economist and someone who's worked closely on the current crisis. Let me begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin people. I also want to acknowledge that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a day that has particular relevance to Tamils on the island and elsewhere. Yesterday morning, the International Monetary Fund approved the 17th bailout of Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka's 75-year history. By any standard of measurement, Sri Lanka is a failed and bankrupt state, devoid of the political and economic leadership to support its most vulnerable and ensure long-term political and economic sustainability. A year ago, the Sri Lankan economy started convulsing with a high shortage of food, fuel, and medicine. Lineups continued until late last year for the essentials. This resulted in mass protest that ultimately led to the resignation of both Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister and Gotabaya Rajapaksa as President. Notably, these two men have been sanctioned by the Canadian government as of January the 10th of this year. After a political tug of war, Ranil Wickremesinghe became Sri Lanka's executive president. The International Monetary Fund engaged in discussions that resulted in a staff-level agreement in September of 2022. We're here today, 6 months after the staff-level agreement, with a program that, while allowing Sri Lanka some breathing room, will essentially force the country into 48 months of international scrutiny. First, the 48-month extended fund facility will be dispersed in 6-month tranches of approximately $333 million at a time, subject to Sri Lanka meeting its obligations. Secondly, Sri Lanka needs to continuously negotiate with creditors such as India and China and to come to an agreement on debt sustainability. Third, while we have not seen the direct mention of curtailing military expenditures, the Sri Lankan government, as part of its budgetary measures, is committed to reducing 30% reduction in the military. Fourth, direct supports will be given to the most vulnerable through direct payment systems as opposed to third-party measures. 5, Sri Lanka is to introduce anti-corruption measures, including financial disclosure for government officials tendering contracts. And 6, Sri Lanka will be the only country in Asia required to undertake a full government diagnostic by the IMF, including on key measures such as the strength of the rule of law. This diagnostic is set to be completed before the release of the next tranche of funds in September of 2023. In short, the IMF agreement approved by the Executive Board imposes some significant measures that will support the island from further deteriorating into a rogue state. Notwithstanding these measures, I'm disappointed that in the lack of focus on gross and serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, and the need to address a long-standing political crisis and to ensure that the North and East on the island have the right to self-determination and the ability to chart its own economic trajectory going forward. In closing, I want to thank the leadership of the IMF, particularly Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Masahiro Nozaki and Peter Brewer, IMF Sri Lanka team, Philip Jennings, Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean, and his entire team for his support, Minister Chrystia Freeland and her team for their continuous engagement on this issue with both the community as well as parliamentarians, and the many, many civil society leaders and people that we met from the ground who worked with the core team to ensure that we had a seat at the table, most notably PEARL, People for Equality and Relief in Lanka. With that, I would like to invite Ahrabi Rajkumar from PEARL, and she's in the UK, to share a few words with us today.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahrabi Rajkumar, and I am the Advocacy and Research Director at People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, also known as PEARL. PEARL is an advocacy organisation concerned with the human rights situation in the northeast of Sri Lanka, We note with the approval of the IMF package earlier today, following the unprecedentedly fast conclusions of a high-level staff agreement and the goodwill of bilateral lenders. This will be the third time since the end of the armed conflict that Sri Lanka has required IMF assistance. We must remember the root cause of Sri Lanka's most recent state failure. The economic and political crisis that resulted in the need for this recent bailout was created through years of corruption, poor economic management, and poor decision-making by successive governments that pander to Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. The current heavy militarization, excessive intimidation and surveillance, and state-sponsored land grabs in the northeast is example enough of why the loan may not go further enough in dealing with Sri Lanka's deep-rooted issues that resulted in the economic crisis in the first place. For there to be long-term sustainable peace and stability on the island, there must be a stronger effort made to ensure justice and accountability for Sri Lanka's war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed against the Tamil people, and importantly, through the normalization of the north and east of Sri Lanka. Cuts must first be made to the excessive military spending on the island, whose significant presence is maintained despite the conflict coming to an end in 2009. There are currently an estimated 200,000 active and reserve military personnel, making it one of the world's highest per capita military forces. The military is credibly accused of systematic and ongoing violations of human rights, including disappearances, extrajudicial executions, sexual violence, and mass atrocity crimes during the conflict. Both the military and government departments, namely the Department of Archaeology, seized private lands belonging to the Tamils, using them to expand military bases, to run military enterprises, or to destroy places of worship, to replace them with Buddhist temples instead, in keeping with the Sinhala Buddhist nationalist ideology that has been characteristic of successive governments in Sri Lanka's history. The military also remains involved in agricultural and fishery activities in the northeast. This activity continues to undermine economic recovery in the north and east, depriving civilians of their economic assets and livelihoods. Bans on Tamil memorialization are also violently enforced by the military, which is an erasure of Tamil history that perpetuates the root causes of the conflict. The Sri Lankan government has stated that it will slash military personnel by a third by next year. However, there must be transparency around how this will change the excessive militarization of the north and east. A commitment of demilitarization was also made by the Sri Lankan government when they received an IMF bailout package in 2009. Despite this commitment, Sri Lanka's military budget increased year on year without facing any tangible consequences for reneging on their commitments. Sri Lanka has a concerning history of reneging on international commitments, including reforms, which they initially agreed to in the UNHRC resolutions, as well as denying international aid to predominantly Tamil areas in the northeast, such as the reneging of the PTOMS agreement from the 2004 tsunami. Sri Lanka's repeated failure to deliver on pledges of structural reform should serve as an important reminder of the need for continued international scrutiny on Sri Lanka. We therefore urge the international community to pressure Sri Lanka to keep its commitments regarding justice and accountability for mass atrocity crimes, demilitarization, and ensure the normalization of the North and East and an acceptable political power sharing solution to the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Arbi. I'd like to now invite Dr. Madura Rasaratnam, Associate Professor in Comparative Politics at the City University in London.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So first of all, thanks, Ahrabi, for those comments, and thanks to Mr. Anandasangaree also for organizing this, so we can share our thoughts on this kind of important moment in Sri Lanka's trajectory. So broadly, I would also like to start by welcoming the IMF's Executive Board's decision to lend Sri Lanka support via the Extended Fund Facility, and hopefully, first and foremost, this will alleviate the real humanitarian disaster and distress that are being experienced by those hardest hit, the war-affected communities in the Northeast, but also those on low incomes across the island. But it's important to note, as Ahrabi has done, that this bailout, Sri Lanka's 16th or 17th, should not be a bailout for the extractive and racist politics, policies, and institutions that have brought about this present mess. So the roots of this crisis run really deep through Sri Lanka's politics and history. And a simple way to think about it is that the main kind of thrust of public resources and institutions since independence have been kind of orientated towards maintaining ethnic dominance, that is Sinhala Buddhist dominance, whilst also marginalizing and disenfranchising other peoples, and this has principally been the Tamils. So this objective has overridden all other objectives, such as creating a productive and dynamic, inclusive economy, expanding the revenue base, and creating a kind of responsive and efficient administrative structure. These have all become secondary to this overarching ethnic aim of public policy for, just over 7 decades since independence. And we can see in the present crisis, this has had 2 major outcomes, right? So as successive governments have prioritized ethnic objectives over economic ones, the economy has deteriorated and spluttered. There have been persistent fiscal and trade imbalances, as well as an over-reliance on external revenue flows, external debt flows. It's really important to note that whilst the recent kind of exogenous shocks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the pandemic, etc., have affected many developing countries, Sri Lanka's profile is really unique. It has the highest ratio of debt repayments to government revenue for any developing country. I think it's over 70%, whereas the next one down is an equally fragile economy, which is Pakistan at 50%. So Sri Lanka's kind of reliance on external flows is really quite distinguishes it from its peer countries, and it's linked to this very ethnic structure of economic and public policy making. So as this economy has deteriorated, ethnic violence, ethnic marginalization has just escalated for the several decades. And secondly to this, of course, what has happened is that domestic political institutions, administrative institutions have deteriorated. They've become extractive, predatory, and deeply politicized. The focus on delivering ethnic goods rather than economic ones. And so public attention has been turned away from the reality of public services, public probity, the need to kind of expand the productive base of the economy. All of these things have taken a back seat, and instead attention has been focused on the persecution, marginalization, and dispossession of Tamils and other non-Sinhala Buddhist groups. And one really important indicator of this is that, as Ahrabi mentioned, the military has now ballooned. It's per capita the largest military in South Asia, larger than the Indian military and larger than the Pakistani military. And there's in the north and east, and it's also an ethnically homogenous military, predominantly Sinhala. And there's now in the war-affected regions, in the Tamil regions, there's 1 soldier for every 2 to 3 civilians. This is completely economically unsustainable. And so these domestic roots, explain some of the kind of real, otherwise inexplicable peculiarities, perversities, one might say, of Sri Lanka today. So I'll just leave you with one anecdote. In the midst of this crisis, and from 2018 onwards, this has been ongoing. As the island faced kind of power cuts, desperate shortages of essential foods and medicines, desperate shortages of fuel, what was happening in the Northeast was that the military and allied Buddhist monks were engaged in ongoing acts of ethnic cleansing. So just to give you one example, in a place called Kurundur Malay in Mullaitivu, since 2018 and until today, Buddhist monks have worked with the military to seize about 400 acres of land that is claimed by Tamils to build a Buddhist temple in a place where there are no Buddhists, right? They've built a kind of quite impressive Buddhist temple. And what's really interesting about this is they've done so explicitly in defiance of a local court order prohibiting construction of any permanent structures on the site until the land dispute has been fully resolved. They've done this in complete defiance of the local courts, right, of the orders of the local courts. And other such examples of militarized land seizure abound in the Northeast. So this one example sums up all of these deep-seated problems, I think, that led to the current crisis. So you have public institutions, here the military, that are just purely extractive of land and resources, and the resources needed to maintain them, purely extractive of land and the resources that go with it. And they work not for public good or public improvement, but for a pure kind of project of ethnic dominance, right? Rather than public good. And they do so in total disregard of the rule of law, in complete violation of the local court's injunction, right? And finally, all of this activity is entirely economically unproductive, right? not only is it using up resources in and of itself, the resources of building this temple in a place where nobody will use it. It will serve no social good at all. But it's also inhibiting that land from being used for other economically productive resources, such as agriculture and the resettlement of displaced people who cannot then become economically productive because they continue to be displaced. So you can see that it's a complete sort of vicious cycle. And unless these deep kind of problems are addressed, unfortunately, this bailout will be a bailout of these institutions. So I'm glad that this bailout has kept Sri Lanka on a strict kind of supervision regime and has checkpoints, and I hope that people.
I think with that, we can now go to Sri Thanabalasingam. I think she was concluding her comments anyway. So, Sri?
Thanks, Gary, and thanks for organizing this. Oh, do we get Madura back? We lost you for a second, Madura.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me again? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that was it. I don't know where you lost me, but yeah.
So,
I was just saying that.
I think
just saying that, you know. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think you concluded. I think we get your conclusion. So thank you for that. And we're inviting Sri to share with us a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And you know, I don't want to belabor the point. I think Madura and Ahrabi spoke eloquently and at length about the issues and about the IMF package in itself. I too welcome it. I think it's an important step forward for Sri Lanka. It's something that was required, especially to deal with the humanitarian and economic crisis at the current moment. There are concerns, of course, going forward of how the funds will be used, whether it's just to bail out already unproductive institutions and firms, or will it be the first step for Sri Lanka on its road to recovery, where it can see more robust economic growth. And for that, demilitarization, of course, is going to be very important. The announcement earlier this year in terms of cutting its military personnel as well as expenditure, it's quite important, because that means these resources can go towards more higher productive areas of the economy, especially the underinvestment in the north and east, where labor force participation is abysmal. So there's a lot of untapped potential there. So really hoping the funds, the capital finds its way to these areas, because with that sort of growth is how we'll see a more sustainable Sri Lanka reach a more sustainable growth path. So some of these policies definitely need to be put in place, and I'm glad that the IMF package has checkpoints along the way to make sure that the authorities, the Sri Lankan authorities, are being true in their promises. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Sri. I think we can now go to any questions or comments. So with that, this concludes our press conference for today. I want to thank our panelists, Ahrabi Rajkumar from Pearl, Dr. Madura Rasaratnam from the City University in London, and Sri Thanabalasingam, an economist. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you.